start. Good morning. It is 9:03 in California. Chris joins us from Windsor, Ontario, and in order, just like he said, in order to make sure people understand where that is, it's across from Detroit, basically. And then Sarah joins us from Germany, and it's about noon in Canada where Chris is, and it's about 5 or 6, 6 p.m. So thank you for joining us from all over the world. And I just want to say welcome, and just a really brief idea about the Center for Truth and Justice. Both Chris and Sarah know us quite well. So the Center for Truth and Justice is a human rights organization that is founded and established in California days after the end of the 44-day war in response to the human rights violations and the atrocities that were committed during the 44-day war by Azerbaijan against Armenians. And the whole purpose is to give voice to the victims and witnesses to atrocities. And as a result, even though it is a mostly California-based organization, in fact, it is no longer that. Both Sarah and Chris know last year we had a big international conference. They joined us in Yerevan despite COVID, despite, a year after the war. And we're doing one this year again. Sarah and Chris would love to have you join us again. And this year's conference is going to be focused on mostly issues regarding Armenia joining the ICC, International Criminal Court, and the likes. And the Center for Truth and Justice relies on this large family of international law experts in human rights, like Sarah, like Chris, in order to achieve the goals that we all share. Human rights does not recognize color, ethnicity, background, nationality. Violations are violations, and they must be addressed. So with that, welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Judge.
Don't call me judge on this. We're having a fun conversation about things. That, okay, so I'm a legal junkie. I mean, this is a very interesting subject to me. But if you give me a second, what I'd like to do is formally introduce both of you so that our participants know a little bit about your background. I'm going to start with Sarah, ladies first. Dr. Sarah Babaian is a jurist, international negotiation expert, and conflict manager. In addition to her practical work, Dr. Babaian lectures on the topics of international criminal law, international law and negotiation at universities, as well as private and public institutions. In addition to her profound expertise in international law, Dr. Babaian advises international companies, as well as states, political actors, international institutions, and non-governmental organizations as a professional negotiation expert. She is a member of the German Armenian Lawyers Association, and together with 2 other members of the association, she is the publisher of the book, Nagorno-Karabakh, a judicial analysis of the conflict concerning Artsakh. Christopher Waters is a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor in Canada. He was dean of the faculty from 2015 to 2021. He has extensive human rights and election monitoring field experience in post-conflict areas, including with the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. His academic interests include international humanitarian law, the use of force in international law, and law in the South Caucasus region. Dr. Waters has published several books, including 3 on the South Caucasus, and his articles on international law have appeared in journals such as the Canadian Yearbook of International Law and the American Journal of International Law. He is co-editor of the Canadian Bar Review. Very briefly, my name is Gassia Apkarian. By day, I'm a judge at a Superior Court in California, and I do jury trials on felony criminal cases. During my off hours, I'm an advisor to the Center for Truth and Justice, and I do what I'm doing right now, which is let's talk law and legalese. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction.
Okay, so here's what I want to say. Today is the 81st day of the blockade of the Lachin corridor. For those of you who don't know what that is, 81 days ago, Azerbaijan people sent by the Azerbaijani government that called themselves eco-activists started demonstrating on the Lachin corridor, which is the main lifeline for 120,000 Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh that connects them to Armenia. In other words, that is the one road that allows for the import and export of all goods, including medicine, transportation, and critical supplies. And that road has been shut down by these eco-activists who are there under Azerbaijani state decision. There's enough evidence for that. And about a week ago, the International Court of Justice ruled on this issue. So first I'm going to ask Chris. Chris, tell us a little bit about what was this about? What is it that the ICJ ended up ruling on, if you could?
Sure. Thanks, Gassia. Well, it's important to recognize that these were requests for provisional measures, so interim measures requested by Armenia, and Azerbaijan in turn requested provisional measures as well. So it takes place in the context of a larger litigation between the parties over the application and interpretation of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which I'm just going to call CERD for the rest of the talk, because it's a very cumbersome term. So that's a treaty that was developed in the late 60s, and Armenia and Azerbaijan are both parties, and it requires the parties to act in a manner which is non-discriminatory or non-racist in effect. Now you might say, well, are Armenians and Azeris, are they races? And we actually, maybe fortunately, don't need to get into that conversation, because CERD also speaks about national origin and ethnicity. So it's important to recognize that these are claims of discrimination on the basis of national origin or ancestry, and that the order that the ICJ just made was provisional. But essentially, Armenia had made 3 requests. One was that there be a ceasing of the orchestration of protests that you just referred to, Gassia. And like you, I would say that these were orchestrated. Azerbaijan is an authoritarian state, and not much happens without the Aliyev regime giving its okay. So I'm very skeptical about that. But the ICJ in the case said that that's not warranted, and so turned Armenia down on that basis. Armenia also requested full provision of natural gas and other utilities, and the court in that regard said there was insufficient evidence for it to make an order in that regard. But maybe the most important one, and I think that's what we'll probably concentrate on, is that Armenia had requested the court to make a provisional order about ensuring uninterrupted free movement along the Lachin corridor. And in that case, and in that regards rather, the court very clearly in a 13-2 decision said, yes, Azerbaijan is required to allow unfettered access across the Lachin corridor.
So just to come back to what you just talked about, utilities, I didn't say anything about that. Can you give a little background on that, and why did they basically deny that request?
Sure. Well, Armenia had alleged that Azerbaijan was responsible for cutting off gas and other utilities. I understand electricity at one point, and perhaps now you'll have a better sense of what's happening on the ground, Gassia, than I do. The center is doing just such fantastic work in documenting on the ground in real time, and using credible legal tools to find out what's happening. So I'm going to defer to you in terms of the situation on the ground right now, but certainly there were allegations that Azerbaijan had cut off power supplies, and we're essentially leaving the people in Nagorno-Karabakh to freeze in the dark, and it resulted in school closures amongst other things. Azerbaijan in its pleadings had said, in fact, it had cooperated and at times repaired the natural gas supply line that had come from Armenia, that in fact cutoffs of power are common throughout the region in both Armenia and Azerbaijan. And there was nothing special, if you like, about Nagorno-Karabakh. And the court simply said, we don't have sufficient evidence on this point. Now, this is a court that doesn't like to be bold. I think that's fair to say. And so where there's not a clear evidentiary basis for acting, the court typically will not act. And so in fact, the clarity and robustness of the order with respect to keeping the Lachin corridor open is actually, I don't want to say rare, it's not rare, but it's noteworthy. Let's put it that way.
Okay, I'm going to ask Sarah. So Chris said uninterrupted free movement was the main decision. I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm not going to look at this from a perspective of a judge. I'm going to look at it as a perspective of, you know, you're looking at legal decisions. This is a victory for Armenia, I think. Just like Chris said, I mean, these kinds of decisions and measures are far and few in between and rare for a court like the International Court of Justice. But so it was a 13-2 decision. Is that right? Sarah, can you tell me what that means? Was it what that's okay, let's go back. There's 15 members to the court, right? If you could take it from there and give us a little bit of information about the build of the court itself and how does it come down to a 13-2?
I mean, it depends on, it can be also for the other application from Azerbaijan against Armenia. It was, I think it was 17 judges, but here it was for 16, I have read. So it's not just that you say it always have to be in 15 judges. But in this instance, it was 13 judges and 2 ad hoc judges. And the ad hoc judges can be, or a state party, you can say to a case can, if there is no judge of its own nationality, then you have the possibility to say you want to have a judge from your own nationality. It doesn't have to be from your own, but you can have someone. In this case, it was one of the ad hoc judges was from Azerbaijan. He was also voting against the order. He was one of the 2 judges. So yeah, so and these ad hoc judges have the same rights like the normal ones. So they start from the beginning until the end, and they take part into this into the legal proceedings.
So okay, so this is an interesting issue because the last time we had panelists, there was confusion about this. So 15 judges, are they the same judges that started with the case back in 2021 when the third case was brought to court? Are they the same 15? Yes. Okay, and then
once they are elected for this case, they will start and they will end the same, but the same judges will end.
So there are 2 ad hoc judges, and one of them is appointed by Azerbaijan, who also happens to be Azerbaijani, correct?
Yes. Yes.
What about the other?
His name is Judge Sir Kenneth Keith, and he was against the order, as well as Judge Yusuf. He comes from Somalia. So when we jump into it, but Chris, you wanted to say something?
Well, I'm just going to say, Judge Keith, you're absolutely 100% right. Judge Keith was appointed by Azerbaijan. I believe he's a New Zealander.
Yeah? Yeah. Oh, okay.
So, nothing hangs on it. He was.
I mean, the name is not Azerbaijan, you're totally right, but it was in brackets written like Azerbaijan, but maybe because he was appointed by.
That's probably it.
Okay, no, but thank you.
And then so the second ad hoc judge, who chose that person?
No, I mean, I think it was Armenia.
Armenia chose the judge who's from.
Has chosen one, and Azerbaijan has chosen one.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And okay, so it's a 13-2. It's not a unanimous vote, right?
No.
Okay. Well, so here's what I have to ask you, because this is the burning pain, right? So ICJ, okay, I'm going to ask Chris, I'm just going to pick on you. They keep saying it's the highest court, it's the world court, okay? I come from state court. I walk in with my robe, I make an order. If I issue a warrant, they got to go arrest that person. You know, if I say to someone, you know, you're being taken in, they're being taken in right now, right? So, you know, I come from, you know, immediate, you know, court orders, just judicial decisions have an effect and take effect immediately, right? And this is supposed to be the highest court. Can you explain what that means? I mean, what is this, the highest court? What does that mean to the rest of the world?
Yeah, 100%. So it's sometimes called the world court. I think you have to put it in the context of a very decentralized legal system. You can't compare, I think, the domestic forum that you're in and the international legal system, because they're just two different beasts, and sort of making an analogy from one to the other just typically doesn't work, because it's a horizontal state-made legal system, but it is the highest court, and there are some you know, truly excellent judges on the court. And I mean, the court is a cautious court, partly because of its arbitral background. You know, it's typically, it used to be more of an arbitration court than a sort of independent judicial body. It still carries vestiges of that, and also given various horizontal aspects that are reflected in the court's procedure itself. The fact that you can appoint ad hoc judges, right? The fact that you can appoint your own judge to the court has vestiges of a very arbitral system, and certainly is reflective of the horizontal legal system that we have. I think it's important to avoid both undue cynicism and undue optimism about the ICJ's decision. I think it is an important legal victory for Armenia. The parties clearly wouldn't have devoted so much time and so many resources, and frankly, there were some very highly paid, you know, hired counsel by both parties and very well known international lawyers. The parties don't spend this much time on things that don't matter. I think it matters in terms of establishing the record in much the same way that the Center for Truth and Justice does, right? It's important that the truth be known. And I think if I can just give a personal example, that's now on record. So a couple of weeks ago, I was testifying before Canada's Foreign Affairs Parliamentary Committee. And there were some members of Parliament on the committee who said, oh, we can't tell, you know, is there a blockade, is there not blockade? We were hearing something from the Azeri Canadian community, we're hearing something from the Armenian community, and we're engaging in some sort of both sidesism, right? The idea that, well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I think now the judicial record is clear. There has been a blockade of a humanitarian corridor, and it is wrong. It's legally wrong, and obviously I think there's ethical dimensions to this as well. So at least the record is clear. And I should say that this is there's a host of war by other means, if you like, that takes place in legal fora, right? So in addition, Armenia and Azerbaijan have litigation for the European Court of Human Rights as well. So this is part of a broader measure, frankly, to not only establish legal right, but to form the basis for world public opinion. And that's unquestionably part of why states take this so seriously. And the mixing of law and politics is just kind of the nature of the beast. You know, but I say to avoid undue cynicism as well, because let's take Judge Keith, for example, who was the Azeri appointed judge. Yeah, it's true. He dissented on the request for provisional measures by Armenia, but he also voted unanimously with the court in turning down Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures. So it's not, while there are political dimensions to this, it's also important to remember that there are legal dimensions. And as lawyers, we work in that space. There are some provisions for enforcement of ICJ's decisions. So under the Charter of the UN, the failure to act upon an ICJ decision is theoretically something that can be referred to the UN Security Council, which can make binding orders. That's a very, very rare occurrence. You can think about Nicaragua referring the ICJ decision in that case against the United States to the Security Council. And you can imagine what a permanent member would do if it thinks its interests are not, are at stake, rather, right? So limited means for enforcement. Theoretically, all states are obliged to carry out the actions of when ordered by the ICJ. There's no legal question about that. But the UN has no, or certainly the ICJ has no independent police force. There's no bailiff that you can directly order. But and I'll stop. But Gassia, you said in your court you make an order and it gets carried out. But I'm going to push back on that just a little bit. For example, so in Canada, courts make injunctions sometimes, and there's been issues where, for example, our national police force won't carry out the orders, or at least in a timely way, when it's been against First Nations, for example, Indigenous peoples, and it's because when you're looking at a state to state or a nation to nation, and if I can give the Indigenous context, the dynamic changes fundamentally. It's a horizontal legal system, and that has its own dynamic. Sarah, you might want to add to that. I think I went on too long. Sorry.
Perfectly correct what you said. Maybe just to add something, because you asked, Gassia, why is it called a world court? And I think it's different to, for example, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, or another court, international court, as this principal judicial organ is one of the United Nations. So it is one of the United Nations, which means that every state of the world is a member to the United Nations. So this is something totally different with regard to the ICC or the European Court, or So I mean, this is giving a lot of power to the ICJ, I think. So and it's very interesting, because if the ICJ is making a decision, or if it's making an order, it's always connected to the UN Charter. Or UN Charter. I mean, going against the UN Charter in combination to the ICJ statute is something else than just saying, okay, we are not conferring to something which is said by a different court. So I think this is giving a different power. Thus, it's tragically that Azerbaijan is not obeying or complying with what the court just said, because it's linked to the UN Charter. And as Chris correctly said, you have these mechanisms in order to say, okay, if the state does not comply, then you have the possibility, the other state, in this case Armenia, to go to the Security Council and say, hey, we have a problem. But then, exactly as what you already said, we have a political problem, because we have 5 permanent members and 1 is Russia. And as we know, even though we say it's our ally, it's kind of not our ally anymore, or not just our ally, it's also the ally of Azerbaijan. So maybe they will block or veto every resolution, which could go for peace and security. So that's the problem. But I mean, I don't want to jump too much into it, because I think maybe later on we will discuss what kind of measures can be taken. But I think the Security Council is a good option, but practically it's tough.
So, okay, so I really like this explanation that you both gave, which is, when you're dealing nation to nation in Canada, for example, just because there's a court order, they stop and think before they execute it. And that's a fantastic analogy. That helps a lot. But so Sarah, you brought us there. It's been 81 days. I'm really hoping I'm not going to call you when it's 181 days and the blockade is still happening. So for us to come back and say, I want to go back to what Chris said. Let me tell you something. When the decision was being read, right, it was very early morning for me, and I was on a text with another one of your colleagues in the international legal world, and we had tears in our eyes, okay, because as a nation of Armenians who have, suffered so many atrocities and genocide, year after year for over 100 years, we're trying to still prove that we were slaughtered, right? And to actually have a court decision that says, this is a blockade, open the blockade, it was validation. Okay, let me just say that. Okay, and in the legal world, you take that piece of paper and that validation and you multiply that, whether it's political or legal or in the UN, because as you all well know, Center for Truth and Justice works very meticulously with UN rapporteurs We send delegations, they meet with them. So it's one thing for us to have to, again, write 15 paragraphs trying to prove the blockade as opposed to saying one line. Hey, ICJ finding, now we're here to tell you, what are you going to do to make sure that this ruling is followed? So that places Armenia and Armenians, right? Artsakh Armenians in a very different stance than we had a week ago. So I just want to put out there that 100% it changes our position. But Sarah,
as you correctly said, it's a very important directive in the direction of justice. Yeah, but in the end, we have to see what are we doing if we have such judgments, or not judgments, but orders, and then they are not followed. Because I mean,
you brought us there, Sarah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about possible measures. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, we have a delegation that's going to Geneva in a couple of weeks. They're in London. They're going there. So last night we had a meeting. And I just want to make sure I gave them the right advice, okay? Because I said, you enter with the ICJ ruling, you parlay that with our, testimonies that reflect on the reality on the ground in Artsakh today, okay? And then part 3 is, what do we ask them to do? Now, I want to see if what I advise them is correct or not. So tell us what we can do. Give us some measures. That would be very helpful.
I mean, I would say there is not just one measure or the measure you can do. Yeah, there are a lot of things you can do. But what Chris already correctly stated is that as there is no sanction mechanism and there is no police force, everything comes back to the states. So in the end, all the states, and that's what makes it so powerful, because it's an ICJ order and everyone has to comply with the ICJ order, and then it's touched to the UN members, and kind of every state is a UN member. They have to see that Azerbaijan complies with the order. And how they can do this, if they exert pressure in a political way, in an economic way, or I mean, to really touch the reputation of Azerbaijan. I think this is what's very, very important. And what I think, from my perspective, I mean, it would be perfect if we have a Security Council resolution, but I'm pretty sure we won't get such a resolution. And the Secretary General already said, yes, I will say it's or my eyes are on this specific point. I will, and he pointed out, he said, okay, there is this ICJ order and it has to be complied with, but I mean, still just words. So from my perspective, only states can really push against Azerbaijan, really make pressure. And what I think is that the European Union could have, I think, exert the greatest pressure, because now you know that we have that kind of gas deal from von der Leyen with our lovely partnership with Aliyev. So I think if they would play that kind of role, or if they warn them and say, you know, if you are not complying with what the ICJ said, maybe we have to overthink our contract. Maybe this would be something which would really hurt Azerbaijan. But I mean, you know that also the European Union is playing a very strange role in this situation. I mean, they are making contracts with autocratic states. What shall we say? And then they say we have a privileged partnership, even though there was already the war in Armenia. And but from my perspective, this would be really something what is hurting.
I'm so sorry. I'm so US centric. I really appreciate the European view. We should always have you come on from Europe. I agree with you. EU and their need to stay warm has been, Chris, what do you think? Any other measures you can think of?
Well, I'm just going to echo what Sarah said, but also just pick up on her point about economic measures. And I intend to call on the Canadian government, for example, to impose sanctions now. There's no question anymore about the legality of the blockade. So I think it's states who are the ultimate enforcers of ICJ rulings in the absence of a Security Council that's willing to act. And so I think it's up to each individual state, and of course regional organizations like the European Union, to take measures now. But also, domestic courts do pay attention to what the ICJ says. The Canadian Supreme Court has on several occasions, for example, cited ICJ judgments. It's an authoritative court. It's a definitive court. As we've seen in the Palestinian Wall advisory opinion, for example, it doesn't change facts on the ground in any kind of immediate way, but it remains a touch point and it changes the conversation, and that's important.
So I'm going to get a little bit more practical and tell me if we're getting a little too far. So in the last 81 days, I was reading this morning, over 140, I think it's 142 or 45, critically ill people from Artsakh were transported to Armenia to literally save their lives. For 81 days, there has not been any surgeries, any serious medical procedures, because they can't. There's not enough electricity, there's no heat, they have no medical supplies. Some of the conversations I've had with witnesses on the ground whose loved ones have been transported, and there have been some deaths. In the very first week during the blockade, a 45-year-old man died, and we inquired, and forensically, if the blockade had not been there, he would have survived. Okay, so now we're talking about serious issues. All right, serious life and limb death. And you said, domestic measures, domestic courts, right? Is this something that can be taken up in domestic courts as a result? There's an ICJ ruling and people are dying.
Yeah, I mean, you run into the problem of sovereign immunity, where you can't, as you'll know, even you can't haul another state per se into your domestic courts. Now, there are some exceptions to that, where, for example, some jurisdictions have exceptions for terrorist actions and other gross abuses of human rights. But generally speaking, you come against the problem of sovereign immunity. But what you can do is take private actors to court in transnational tort actions who are, for example, involved in natural resources. If they are in some ways contributing to the human rights situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, then individual litigants would be free, depending, of course, on the individual states' regimes, right? They have the Alien Tort Statute in the US, right? So maybe that kind of action. Certainly in Canada, we recently saw a case where some miners from Eritrea took a Canadian mining company to court because they alleged the Canadian mining company had engaged in human rights abuses, including forced labor. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you've got a case, and we're sending it back to trial for the trial court to decide this. Now, of course, the mining company immediately settled with the miners, and so we don't know how that will transpire. But I think there is scope for creative litigation in domestic courts that is now bolstered by the ICJ ruling, because there's a finding of fact on this point. And so I think that there's some interesting transnational court opportunities.
I'm going to come back to that, because there is the issue of the mine that has been shut down, but we're getting a little far from that. I have a question for Sarah. A few days ago, Jurist Gagosian, who represents the sovereignty of Armenia in the European Court at the ICJ and the European Court of Human Rights, and made a statement about a 3-judge panel. Did anyone catch on to that? Is there such a thing that you go back to the ICJ for a tribunal or a 3-judge panel? Anybody?
Chris?
Go ahead, Sarah. I'm not. I've seen reference to it on provisional orders, supervised. I believe it's supervisory over provisional orders. But honestly, I don't want to misstate anything. So I'm gonna defer there.
Yeah, I'm also not so sure to say something to it, but let me add something. Sorry, just coming back to your question. There's also one thing, it's not in Germany, it is already in force. It's the due diligence in supply chains. So we have that. I mean, it should be also, it's getting enforced in Europe also, but I don't know when exactly in the European Union. But it says like that you cannot, like for companies, cannot make or have contracts with the government of states which are officially or which are clearly going against human rights. So they say you are also getting in touch with it. So if you know what's going on, and even though you are supporting these states, you're also responsible for what's happening. This is also, for example, something what is our German Armenian institution or association is doing or looking at right now to really see what kind of companies are into this kind of field. So this is also something one could do. Yeah, in order to, it's also going against the reputation of the country, yeah, to really say, hey, you have to see what's going on. No one else can say, we didn't know. Yeah? This is a bit what the due diligence in the supply chain should do. This is something which just came into my mind. But I mean, it's not going really directly against the state, you know, I mean, it's a process, but it's a good one. But it's not like that Azerbaijan would say, okay, now we have to immediately stop the blockade. Yeah, but I mean, it is something what really can go against the reputation of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple of questions. I'd like to give some of these questions. I don't know. I have no idea if you guys can see these questions. We have one from Ara Razarian. It says, would this decision change the international behavior of either Azerbaijan, which has gas treaties with EU, or the behavior of EU, which is a democratic space, but deals with a state which does blockade, as already established by the ICJ? I think Sarah spoke to that a little bit. Do you want to just, speak about that just briefly?
I mean, it would be wonderful if the European Union would say, okay, there is this judgment, and now Azerbaijan, please. I mean, they don't have to coerce them to do something, but I mean, they could sit behind the doors and can say, okay, you know what, there is this judgment. We cannot be connected to you if you are not like complying with orders of the most important court we have on earth. Yeah, sounds a bit high, but you know what I mean. I mean, this could be something, and this is what I said, it would be wonderful if the EU would do something like this, but I don't know if they would do it for political reasons, just for political reasons. Yeah.
So
but it would, I think it would be a good measure.
I'm going to add something minor to this, because I'm not a panelist, I'm just a moderator, but it's very interesting to me that soon after the ICJ ruling, I've been reading, so basically in the past week, there seems to be direct discussions or negotiations between representatives of Artsakh, of Karabakh, and Azerbaijan. And prior to the ICJ ruling, it didn't seem like that was happening. Is this something that I've noticed? Am I wrong? Or do you think this is, does the ICJ ruling perhaps give the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh some tools to work with? Any thoughts? We don't know, right?
Sorry.
Not clear.
I don't think it's clear. I mean, it's the ICJ is a state-to-state court. It's an interstate court, and so it didn't address, civil society groups. It didn't address national minorities. It's really addressed to Armenia and to Azerbaijan. I mean, whether that changes. I mean, if what you say is true, Gassia, that's great news, right? Because the people affected may have some additional voice. I think it certainly gives groups which are trying to move goods across the blockade additional legal tools, right? So, for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we know some of their vehicles have been going back and forth taking urgent supplies. Now, the ICRC generally works on a confidentiality basis, so they're never going to come out and say this is what's happening. Yeah, but now when they come up, when they deal with as the Azerbaijani government, they can now have an additional legal tool in their arsenal. So I think it's on multiple levels and with multiple organizations and at multiple touch points with states and non-state actors, such as the Center for Truth and Justice, that we're going to see the needle get moved, however slowly.
So the comment was, yes, Aliyev was very clear before that he would never speak to the people of Artsakh, but now he does. Okay, so there seems to be some movement with that needle. Sometimes I'm not sure if it's a good thing to talk to them or not talk to them. I'm not privy to any of those conversations, and I'm glad, because as a part of the Center for Truth and Justice, we like to stay out of those types of, those are highly political conversations, and we have no business in it.
But it's funny because, sorry to interrupt, but it's funny, it's always the clash between like judicial proceedings and political proceedings. In the end, everything is political, because I mean, even the ICJ as a judicial institution is at the end in the implementation of the order, it's only political. That's so terrible, I know that, but in the end, it's because I mean, the United Nations, it's not an independent organ. I mean, it's consisting of 185 countries, and I mean, this is solely political.
So one of the things we do on a weekly basis is we have law clinics in Armenia and Artsakh, and we have guest speakers. One of these days you'll get tapped on the shoulder to come and join us one night. But so we discuss these things. We teach about international law, and there's a lot of skepticism, both from Armenia and Artsakh, because when you're the person who's living day in and day out, and like today, the news is that Azerbaijanis have been shooting at farmers who are working, their agricultural lands, and they can't, work their lands. It's a very different prism, right? I mean, we can sit here and have a fantastic legal conversation and feel good about this, but when you're the person who's suffering the day in and day out, it's a different perspective. So one of the things we've talked about is, what about, okay, so you're not, the ICJ ruling hasn't affected your life today. What would the world look like if there was no ICJ or no ICJ ruling? So the reason I want to put that out is because I know we have a lot of people from Armenia and Artsakh that have joined us, okay? And I just want, Chris, if you could talk about this, the purpose of the ICJ is really not to take one country or another to court and prosecute and punish. It is to find alternatives to armed warfare. Am I right? Could you speak to that?
You are right. And in fact, the Secretary General of the United Nations started when he recognized the ICJ judgment, and when he said, "I'll be watching that the Lachin corridor be open." He also said, "I want to thank the states for agreeing to submit their dispute to the ICJ." Now, it's a little bit of smooth talk, because both states, as party to CERD, had an obligation to settle their disputes under CERD. And in fact, CERD in some ways may not be the most obvious mechanism to do this, but once Armenia brought a case, Azerbaijan had no real alternative but to respond to it. But it's what is it? Churchill said, "Jaw is always better than war," right? Talking is always better than war. Now, Gassia, as you say, on the ground, things look very different. And if people are cynical who are listening, I would say I share your cynicism. It's impossible to look at the international legal system and not approach it with a jaundiced, cynical eye. But I think we can go too far there and dismiss it too easily, because it does matter, and states think it matters, and they spend a lot of time on it. And it's important for people on the ground in Karabakh and in the region more broadly to know that the world is watching, and to know that there is now finding a fact by the world's highest judicial organ that a humanitarian blockade, or a blockade of humanitarian supply had been put in place, and that there's now a legal obligation to dismantle it. It won't move the needle immediately. It's not to say that states never obey the ICJ. They typically do, just in the same way that they typically obey the European Court of Human Rights. When the European Court of Human Rights has made an order, the fines generally get paid. And Russia, for example, was even generally paying its fines before it withdrew from the jurisdiction of the court. So states generally obey ICJ decisions in the same way that they do other international tribunals. And there's ultimately a selfish reason for doing that in a horizontal legal system, right? And it has not only to do with reputation, but also the fact that you might not like the decision that went against you today, but if you intend to use this judicial organ, tomorrow, you need to show good faith. So the convention, the case is still pending, right?
That's what
Azerbaijan's memorial is due in January 2024. Armenia filed its memorial in January 2023, and Azerbaijan now has 1 year. Azerbaijan, if it comes to the court with unclean hands a year from now, as showing that it hadn't dealt with the Lachin blockade or the orders of the court, it will do, it's not a strategically smart move.
Yeah.
So even if the Aliyev regime is not out of the goodness of its heart or its belief in international law going to dismantle the blockade, they're going to be more cautious. They're certainly going to be more cautious about approaching the blockade because the matter isn't done with yet at the court, and the world is watching in a way that they weren't even a few weeks ago.
Sarah.
Yeah, I think totally correct what you said. I just wanted to say it's a bit strange strategically thinking that when you say they are not obeying to the order, but I mean there is still a pending case. So I mean Azerbaijan really loses its kind of credibility in front of the ICJ, and I think that's, I mean, some say, I don't know whether it's correct or not, Azerbaijan is only not doing anything because it is just an order and not a decision. What in my opinion is totally crazy, because I mean otherwise provisional measures wouldn't make sense at all if they say, okay, they are not binding. And I mean they said in their order at the end, this is a binding order and you have to implement it. And I mean even the Secretary General said that, and I don't know, I think 3 or 4 member states already reaffirmed. Also Germany said, okay, there is this ICJ order which has to be implemented. So I think that's quite clear, but it's very strange they don't move at all. Yeah, because I mean, it's still pending. And I mean, what will the ICJ think? I mean, they are just undermining everything what, yeah, kind of Armenia has as allegations. I mean, somehow for us, it's good for the end of the story, but not for right now. I mean, right now it's terrible.
So we have 10 minutes left. I'd like to be a stickler because we all need to go to the rest of our lives. And otherwise we could just do this all day. I want to ask you, Sarah, about, and there's a question about it. We want to talk about Azerbaijan versus Armenia. In this last decision, it was a 13-0 vote. Okay. Can you talk, we only have, 10 minutes, sorry. But can you talk a little bit about what is it Azerbaijan asked for in this last motion, if you will, and why do you think it was denied?
Azerbaijan said that there were new evidence that Armenia is laying down landmines in civil areas, and that they are doing this in order to, yeah, kind of harm the Azerbaijani citizens. And but they said the same at I think in December or a bit before, but I mean the court decided already in December last year that that Azerbaijan could not or was not able to produce evidence that this is really true. And then they also said that in the convention, in the cert, it's not written that you are not able or capable to put such landmines into areas which are not, I mean, of course, not in civil areas. And Armenia could prove that these landmines which were found, they weren't in the areas Azerbaijan said they were positioned. So they dismissed the order in December, the ICJ, and said the same for now. And they said it was not even a new evidence that they harmed the people.
So they basically came back with the same claim and no new evidence. You agree?
They tried to make a new one out of it, but it was exactly no new. I mean, it's very funny because if you see what Azerbaijan does, it's always like repeating what Armenia does. Armenia claimed or applicated in September 2021, and then a couple of months later, Azerbaijan said something or claimed or requested provisional measures. And then it was the same when Armenia came in December, and then they came in January, like it's okay, they are doing something against us, so now we have to do something, even though they have no evidence. And I think also Professor Dr. Kolb, he was the one who was talking about landmines, and he really, I mean, his evidence was quite clear that this allegation is totally, he could nullify the allegation.
Chris,
I think, sorry, Gassia,
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, Sarah's absolutely right. The court essentially said no new evidence. But I think reading between the lines a little bit, there was also a sense that the landmines were connected to a military purpose and weren't an act of racial discrimination, right? Look, can we all be clear? Landmines are offensive, right? They kill and they maim, and they do so indiscriminately. And I would like nothing more than for this world to be rid of landmines. And speaking of the U.S., so glad that the Biden administration is indicating its interest in further banning landmines. But anyways, I digress. But all I was saying is there was no nexus between racial discrimination and the military purposes of the landmines. And it was a unanimous decision, as has been pointed out. But there were some declarations attached. So declarations are not dissents; they're just sort of an interpretive explanation of why I voted in the way I did. And I actually think it's worth looking at these declarations. Judge Sebutinde, for example, said, yes, I agree with my colleagues about the landmines, but also Azerbaijan did not manage to show that the booby traps, which had been placed in some homes apparently, were attributable to the state. And so I thought that was an interesting thing. I mean, obviously booby traps are also really problematic, but they weren't attributable to the state. And Judge Keith, who was appointed by Azerbaijan and voted against Azerbaijan in its request for provisional measures, said, I'm going to quote this actually, by their very nature, landmines are indiscriminate in their effects. And the requested measure would require Armenia to take actions in areas which Azerbaijan has now recovered, which are part of its sovereign territory. How could Armenia undertake those tasks? So I think there was a realism on the part of the court too, that making any provisional order in this regard would be a kind of a foolish kind of fiction, and bring the court's order into disrepute if it simply couldn't be carried out. So I just wanted to make those additional nuances maybe, but this is another essential victory for Armenia, really.
Oh, totally true. Very good that you added that point. And Armenia, I mean, kind of justified and said, okay, just because there are these booby traps could be handed out or could be laid down by anyone, yeah, and not by us. I mean, just because citizens are doing this because they had to leave their country, yeah. So I think they did quite a good job. So they couldn't justify.
Okay, where do we go from here? What are we looking for? What's on the horizon for the ICJ? Armenia versus Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan versus Armenia. What date and what are we looking for, Chris?
As far as I know, there's no date set for the actual the oral arguments to be made. Azerbaijan now has, as I said, till January 2024 to file its counter memorial, which is a kind of factum to make put in at least a common law context. So we're not going to see a decision on the merits of the case for some time. And on the merits, just from the perspective of an international lawyer, this is not of much interest in terms of what's the outcome. But there's a really interesting discussion to be had about to what extent CERD can be used in this kind of context, in the racial discrimination context or the national origin context, to deal with what is at least in part a sort of law of armed conflict issue, right? At least in part. So there's some interesting, from an international lawyer's perspective, some interesting nuances to take place at the merit stage, but that's not going to be for some time. I wouldn't be surprised to see one or both parties come back to the court for provisional measures again. A year is a long time. So if Azerbaijan does not comply with the obligation to end the blockade, it's possible to see Armenia come back to the court and request supervision in that regard. But I think it's important to recognize that this is to some extent one of a multiple front legal strategy, right? That's taking place at the state level, at the regional and international organization level, and at the civil society level, and it's just moving the needle, bit by bit here. None of this is easy, as you know better than anyone, Gassia. But
let me just ask one more question to Sarah, and this could be me again with my judge hat, so I try to remove it as much as I can. So on the issue of utilities of gas and that was denied, right, in the provisional measures, because they said not enough evidence, but they said not enough evidence and our finding is without prejudice. When a judge says, or judges say without prejudice, that means the door is open. Do you agree with it?
Yeah,
Okay.
of course. I mean,
And
in the moment when they have more or better or improved evidence, of course, you can discuss the fact further.
but that wasn't true in the other provisional measures. I mean, other provisional measures were denied and they never said without prejudice. Am I wrong? For example, the issue with the Azerbaijan and the mines, they didn't say this decision is without prejudice. But does that mean they can go back as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, at this stage, you're dealing with irreparable prejudice and urgency is the test.
Yeah.
And so unless the court finds that, it's leaving all determinations to the merit. So it could come back on any of these issues.
Okay. So last 30 seconds. Any thoughts about anything coming up or about the ICJ? Sarah, Chris, anything you want to say to wrap it up?
I mean, from my perspective, I just can hope and pray that the state community will, come together now, and really that you have a loud outcry to implement the order, because it's not just to end the blockade, but also to take not away the credibility of the ICJ. Because in the end, I don't know, Antonio Cassese, one of the former presidents of the ICTY, he once said to the ICTY, it is a giant without arms and legs. And I just can hope that nothing or not the same becomes apparent for the ICJ. And then you also don't have the deterrent effect of seeing what can happen if you have such a ruling, because otherwise every state will say, okay, it doesn't matter, we can go in front of the ICJ, and so what, we are not complying. So I just can hope that the community comes together and really finds a solution to implement this order.
Yeah.
Chris?
I would say the same, especially for citizens outside of Armenia. I mean, obviously the Armenian government is in full support of the rights of Karabakh residents. But I would say for citizens of other countries, take up with your government, ask them to apply sanctions, ask them to apply diplomatic measures. I was very happy to see the Netherlands within a very short period after the ICJ ruling was put out, calling on Azerbaijan to comply. I would like to see every country do that. So put pressure on your government. Let's continue to hold the Aliyev authoritarian regime to account. Let's not demonize ordinary Azeri people. Let's continue though to hold this repressive authoritarian regime to account and to bring light on the subject. And if the ICJ ruling did that in some small measure, then that's important and something to take.
I think it was a big measure. I take huge pride in the fact that we have something on the dockets from a legal perspective that supports the allegations that Armenia has been trying to make. I see this as a big victory, and one that needs to continue, which is why this organization is called Truth and Justice. You know, you base it on facts, you base it on evidence, and then you demand that you go into courts and tribunals and not take up arms and fight each other. Let's take it away from that territory and let's keep talking and fighting legally. Sarah, thank you so very much. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you. And if I could just thank not only you, Gassia, but also people behind the scenes putting this together, and the many questions that we didn't get to. I want to thank everybody for putting their questions, and they're all, I'm taking a screenshot and I want to think about some of these questions off time. So I just want to express gratitude for the people who put questions in the box and that we didn't get a chance to answer as well. Gassia, sorry for interrupting.
No. What I want to say is that we've recorded this. We will have it up on our website. It will be published, and we will make the opportunity for people's questions to be answered available to them. We will also ask you to come back as life develops in the legal world for Armenia and Artsakh. Hopefully we go on this trajectory, which is quite positive. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.